Hello, everyone, and welcome to our fifth of six in a webinar series around child care emergency preparedness and response. And this first webinar, this fifth webinar on response, recovery, and rebuilding is just about to begin. I wanted to let you know that I am Abby Cohen, the Region 9 State Systems Specialist, and there you have a picture of me. And I'll be moderating today's webinar. I want to turn first to my colleague, Lori Sommerfeld, who will walk you through the technology logistics.
Hello, everyone. Oops, moved ahead a little bit too quickly there. First off, I just wanted to say welcome and that this meeting is being recorded so that we can share this content with other colleagues that weren't able to make it and to post on our website. Right now, the webinar is being broadcast through your computer speakers, and we did confirm that that was working. If you have questions for the presenters about the topics discussed, please feel free to write a question in the Q&A pod that is in the top center of your screen. If you have general comments or an immediate need, they can be entered into the chat pod at the bottom middle of your screen. So even though there isn't a way for you to contribute vocally on this webinar, we do very much encourage you to participate. Unfortunately, on a webinar with this large of an audience, we are unable to do much troubleshooting for individual participants. Please keep in mind that if you're experiencing trouble with your technology, a recording of this webinar will be sent around to all who registered for the webinar. And in addition, many of the problems that people experience can be resolved by exiting the meeting room and joining right back in again. And with that, I'm ready to pass it right on back to Abby so that we can get started.
Thank you, Lori. I wanted to give a bit of a series overview before we get started. And I know that for many of you, you have been on previous of these webinars. However, there are some of you who will be joining for the first time. So I wanted to give a sense of what we have already covered in this series. We have looked at creating a plan and the need to bring together a whole variety of stakeholders. We've touched on subsidy issues, licensing issues. We have looked at the training and support that's necessary for child care providers. And today we are focused on response, recovery, and rebuilding. And the last webinar will be on recovering and responding to trauma. We have been very pleased to have a whole variety of presenters that have really been able to share their expertise through these webinar series. And that includes people from the federal government, state officials, national experts, and we also are really fortunate on this call to have people directly dealing on the front lines, the resource and referral, and child care provider. As you know, the states and territories have been able to choose which webinars may be most pertinent to them and which they participated. And as Lori mentioned, the participants in this webinar have been able to participate through a variety of mechanisms. And again, we're sorry that we can't just have a big discussion about this, but given the numbers of participants, that's just not possible. And as Lori mentioned, and I will say again, all of these webinars are being recorded, can be listened to, and in addition, there will be additional resources that will be shared with all the participants at the conclusion of the webinar series. And for those of you state administrators who are working on this as one of the things that you are looking at as a TA goal, there are a variety of people that can provide technical assistance. So we're going to move on and do a poll. I'm happy to say that there are 44 jurisdictions that are on this call, as well as 210 registrants. So we have a high level of interest, but we're interested in learning a little bit more about who you are. So if you could let us know of these possible categories, who's actually on the call that is of interest to us, and I'm sure to your fellow listeners. Okay, So let's see. Well, about half of you are state and territory administrators and staff. We also have a fairly high proportion of resource and referral agencies. We're looking also at we've got some training and technical assistance providers, regional offices, and we've also got folks from child care licensing and emergency medical services, so quite a variety of folks with us on the call today. So let me move to today's agenda. I will be starting off by looking at really providing you with some overview and some considerations. Then we'll move to lessons learned from Superstorm Sandy. We're going to have an opportunity to look at caring for children in shelters. We'll hear from FEMA, and we will close with some lessons learned from Katrina and Isaac, and that will be coming from Child Care Resource and Referral and a child care provider that's joined us. So who are these folks? We're so happy and happy to have on our call with us today Beverly Wellens, the Regional Program Manager from Region 3. We have Sarita Fritzler from Save the Children. We have Molly Avancho and Angela Lohman from FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency. And we also have Diana Constant from the Agenda for Children in Louisiana, and Rita Perilou, who's also a child care provider from Louisiana. And I want to let you know that biographies and contact information is going to be sent to all of you following this webinar. And I will also thank my fellow colleagues on the call who are part of the Emergency Preparedness and Response team out of the Child Care State System Specialist Network, and that includes Susan Rohrbaugh of Region 5, Gail Kelso in Region 6, and Lori Sommerfeld, who you've already heard from around the technology. We're going to move now into an interactive opportunity around thinking about, when you think about response, recovery, and rebuilding after an emergency or disaster, what words come to mind? And the way that this will work, and you'll see up above, is the question. When you think about response, recovery, and rebuilding after an emergency or disaster, what comes to mind? In the white below the box, you will see a place where it says enter your message here, and I see lots of folks already doing it. So what are the things that people are thinking about that come to mind? And the frequency with which the audience is responding is demonstrating that those are themes that really resonate with folks. So we're really big on communication, and I think everyone would agree that that is a critical feature of good response and rebuilding after an emergency or disaster. We're seeing collaboration, reunification, chaos. Hopefully this work around planning can help us. Same with confusion. We're seeing things like keeping families. We've got support, shelter, trust, respite. So lots of different thoughts here. Stabilizing, we've got care, we've got compassion. Many, many different things come to mind, but it is very clear from this word cloud that communication beats out everything else, and I think that is something that everyone feels pretty strongly about. Okay, we can move along, Lori, and we'll get back looking at this overview. Okay. So for those of you who have joined us previously, you know that we have emphasized this throughout the webinar series, but I would also like to emphasize it today for those people who have not yet joined us. But this is very important work, and nobody can question that, given that every time we've done this webinar, we are basically doing it almost to the day of something going on in the country. And I know because I work with Hawaii that they have been experiencing a hurricane. And so the reasons that we do this work, and it's very important because it really can minimize injury and death to children who are particularly vulnerable. We know that preparation can minimize the psychological impact and can help promote resilience, and that will be the topic of our next webinar. We also are aware that planning and preparation can reduce the revenue that is lost and also minimize provider liability while also providing continuity of care. And finally, we really know that child care is a vital community service because once child care is up and running, it really can support the entire community coming back to life. Here you will see a copy of the information memorandum that the Office of Child Care has made available to states and territories to provide guidance to help them in the development of their comprehensive emergency plans. We know this is very complicated work, but we hope that by chunking it out as we have done and in a parallel way to the framework, that it will help you engage in this work in a systematic and sequential way. As you note on this slide, we are focused today on numbers 4 and 5, provision of temporary child care services after a disaster and rebuilding child care after a disaster. Okay, and in that information memorandum, there are some very specific pieces of information and guidance that the Office of Child Care provides, and we'll be touching on some of these pieces. And so I want to just mention a few of them here. Clearly, one of the big pieces is coordination with all of the emergency management officials, the R&Rs, the voluntary organizations, all of whom can be very helpful in implementing temporary child care services. We will be focusing on temporary operating standards that would be used both in a temporary shelter as well as thinking about the waiver of certain regulatory requirements. We've talked about that in webinar 3 related to licensing. There we'll be touching upon training and screening of those who might be providing services as volunteers after a disaster, and provisions for establishing and maintaining temporary child care potentially in other relocated sites when existing facilities are severely damaged or destroyed. And then we're also going to be looking at that rebuilding process. So a strategy, first of all, to determine what is the condition of the facilities after an event. And again, we talked about this when we had our webinar on licensing, but we will also be talking a little bit about that today. There's a need for training strategies for providers around business continuity, strategies to provide information and resources around the financial aspect. And we're pleased to have on the call today some folks from FEMA to talk about two of the areas that relate to child care. Here I want to talk about just a few considerations before we launch into our wonderful presenters. The first is that in terms of assessing the immediate situation after an emergency, our utmost concern really goes to reunifying families and making sure that we do not have children who are separated from their families. Then we're going to look at child care needs and the conditions of facilities. When we look at child care needs, I want you to sort of keep in mind all of these areas. We have a need for care for children in disaster claim centers. So we've got families who are lined up potentially filling out forms who need some care for their children while they're doing that. We need care for children of emergency responders. So how is it that all of those folks will be able to get out to perform their duties? We have a need for care for children in temporary shelter situations. And for those of you who are aware of the lingo of emergency preparedness, that's part of ESF, the Emergency Support Function number 6, which deals with mass care. We also need help for existing or potentially even new providers to set up temporary freestanding child care facilities that might not have been the licensed facility due to a problem that they've had. And we also need help with existing providers that need to make repairs and rebuild after the emergency or disaster. So these are all considerations. And then when we're thinking about this, who can help out? Who is there to really assist the families and the providers after there's been an emergency or disaster? And again, we're fortunate to have FEMA on the phone today, but there are a whole host of resources that all of you should keep in mind and connect with. That includes the Small Business Administration. There may be the availability of disaster unemployment assistance. There may also be other public dollars. In the case of Superstorm Sandy, there were special appropriations under the Social Services Block Grant. The volunteer organizations active in disasters. Now we have Save the Children on to present today, but there are many other voluntary organizations as well that are key players that you should be connecting with. And finally, private philanthropy. This is another area where people have been extremely helpful, but we'll hear from the R&R and from child care providers about that kind of coordination that's necessary when there's, for example, lots of donations and there needs to be some coordination. So those are all things to keep in mind. But what I'd like to do now is turn it over to Beverly Wellens, the Regional Program Manager in Region 3. And she will be talking to us as someone who was formerly the CCDF State Administrator in New Jersey and was deployed back to New Jersey after Superstorm Sandy. So you can take it away, Bev.
Thank you, Abby. As Abby said, I am currently in Region 3, but was deployed to New Jersey after Superstorm Sandy slammed into the East Coast on October 29th, 2012. New Jersey and New York were the states on the East Coast that had the highest number of fatalities and damages. It was a very, very difficult time in the first few days after the storm hit because the storm caused mass destruction of homes, schools, child care programs, service agencies, and the actual infrastructure. Fortunately for us, reunification was not an issue because warnings and alerts were issued and the storm hit in the early morning hours when most of the children were with their families and were at home. Conditions would have been much worse in New Jersey had children been in care when that storm hit. Evacuation and mass movement displaced many families who were placed in shelters, hotels, and motels. Coastal communities in New Jersey were the hardest hit, but damages and flooding also occurred in inland areas. There were power outages that affected large areas of the state, and people were having trouble with landline phones as well as cell phones. Children were separated from their schools, Head Start programs, and child care programs, and some families were actually evacuated to neighboring communities, while others were forced to evacuate far from home due to a very, very limited availability of shelters, hotels, and motels. We found that building and electrical contractors swarmed into the area and in many cases had taken up all the rooms in one individual hotel. So it was very, very difficult for people to remain in their areas. The families were actually in such a high level of crisis mode that they were not aware of the social and emotional toll that the whole experience had on their children. So we really, really had to work to get information out to encourage families to return their children to normalcy as much as possible by returning them to school, to their child care programs, and to Head Start programs. Many families lost the ability to maintain their employment due to a lack of transportation and or massive damage to their employer sites. Also, public transportation in many of those areas was either non-existent or just not reliable for the first couple of weeks after the storm hit. Also, communication efforts were hindered by power outages and a lack of telephone services, as I previously said. And during the first few days, the Administration for Children and Families was unable to communicate with our state officials who administer the CCDF program to obtain damage information. In fact, some of the state officials were also personally impacted by the storm. So that word search with the word communication being so big is really critical at a time like this. Also, emergency responders were affected by the storm, and that resulted in delayed efforts to assess damages. We had gasoline shortages, which required the state to develop a rationing plan, and child care licensing inspectors were hampered by infrastructure damages to streets and roads that included flooding, and also, again, a lack of telephone services, so they couldn't contact the licensed child care centers and Head Start programs. Also, when it came to family child care homes, there was no consolidated database of family child care homes. In New Jersey, family child care providers are voluntarily registered by the CCR&Rs, and they maintain locally developed databases. As a result, there was no consolidated list of home-based programs, so all contact was contingent upon the local agency's ability to contact those providers, many of whom had homes that were damaged or had lost power and telephone access, or even were evacuated to areas far away from home. Some agencies, child care centers and Head Start programs didn't have well-developed continuity of operations plans, so the families in the hardest hit areas were unable to access those services. Many of the programs had either no or inadequate emergency response and recovery plans and were unable to inform parents about their operating status and failed to have continuity of operation plans, which could have included plans for alternate operating sites. So that is a big consideration in planning. Families needed information to assist them with re-engaging their children with school, child care, and Head Start. So those of us who were working to support this initiative worked on the development of a flyer with toll-free numbers for the Department of Education, Head Start, and Child Care Resource and Referral Services, and they were actually distributed to the families that were housed in shelters, hotels, and motels, and it talked about the importance of re-engaging children in their programs to reduce their stress as a result of the storm. We found that providers needed information and support for restoring their facilities, and the ones that tried to remain open needed to be assessed for safety. And because of a lack of heat and electricity, mold developed quickly in some of those closed facilities, and costly mold remediation had to be conducted. Unfortunately, we heard about some unscrupulous contractors because so many flooded the heavily affected areas, and they provided less than acceptable repairs, which delayed the openings of those programs even further. Affected facilities needed to be inspected by licensing as well as the local fire and health inspectors before they could reopen, and the high demand for health and safety inspections also caused delays. Fortunately, the voluntary organizations provided on-site child care at the disaster relief centers, and they also provided respite care in the shelters. Most of the disaster relief centers in New Jersey had on-site child care services provided by volunteer organizations to occupy the children while their parents applied for assistance. I heard many parents say that was truly a blessing because they were so distracted with needing to provide all the necessary information to apply for assistance. Those organizations also assess the sites to determine the feasibility of offering services at each of the locations. Of course, there were some smaller disaster relief centers where there just wasn't adequate space, but for the most part, the disaster relief centers offered on-site child care. Those volunteer organizations also provided on-site respite care for the families who were residing in the shelters. Again, parents cited that as a blessing. The disaster case managers were brought in by the voluntary organizations, and they came from many areas of the country. Fortunately, most of them were highly experienced in assisting families, but they didn't have information about the New Jersey infrastructure and resources that were available in New Jersey. So we worked with the Department of Children and Families, and they provided New Jersey-specific training and resource information to the disaster case managers, many of whom, as I said, had lots of experience, but just were not familiar with New Jersey. As far as some lessons learned from Superstorm Sandy, I can say honestly that it's really, really critical to have a well-coordinated plan for assessing and reporting damages. We need to determine what information is needed to assess damages, who will collect it, and disseminate it to whom. Several entities asking different questions can contribute to increased confusion, stress, and loss of valuable time. The programs, agencies, and governments must be prepared with adequate COOP plans. States and early care education programs must prepare emergency response and recovery plans for every disaster situation imaginable in coordination with emergency management officials, public health departments, regulatory agencies, CCDF administrators, CCR&R agencies, and other key partners. Those plans need to be well coordinated and shared. Also, emergency contacts and backup information needs to be available and updated regularly. Agency and program staff need to be trained and must voluntarily practice evacuation procedures on a routine basis, and they need to be familiar with the response and recovery plans and establish timelines for updating and ensuring that all emergency contacts are routinely updated. And, for instance, you may want to establish a routine time, say monthly or every 6 days, and keep that as a constant reminder. States also need to be aware of the flexibility policies, and one of those examples is OCC's flexibility in spending CCDF funds in response to federal or state declared emergency situations. Providers also need to be informed about resources to support recovery. And there are lots of resources available on the Office of Child Care website. You will get that information after the webinar. And provider databases must be consolidated and routinely updated. State officials and CCR&Rs need cell phone or alternate telephone contact and email addresses of all providers. Those also need to be routinely updated and distributed. Information about resources should be distributed, and that would be resources that support recovery to ensure that providers are fully aware. And the most important lesson of all is don't wait until a disaster strikes. Thank you.
Thanks, Bev. And this is just a final picture of some of the damage that occurred and the rebuilding process after Superstorm Sandy. I'm going to turn it now over to Sarita Fritzler, who is the Manager of Emergency Response and Recovery for Save the Children, and she'll be talking to us in large part about their wonderful Child-Friendly Spaces initiative. Sarita?
Yes, hi. Thanks so much. I'm happy to be on this webinar. We're going to talk about child-friendly spaces, but before we do that, just to give a little bit of overview, I know this is not new to a lot of you, but just to look at what we are here in the U.S., the risk for and we're a nation at risk, and knowing that children are the most vulnerable. And so we know that disasters can strike anywhere at any time, and each day 69 million children, that's a significant number, 69 million are either in childcare or school and definitely separated from their families and their caregivers. We know that 21 states and Washington, D.C. don't lack the basic standards for keeping children safe in their child care facilities and schools because they don't have a plan. They don't have a disaster plan. And following Hurricane Katrina, it took 7 months to reunite the last child with her family, which for the United States is just unprecedented and is very, very shocking that that would happen here. And then also we know that children who are affected by large disasters are 5 times as likely to have serious emotional issues than those unaffected. So this is the landscape that we're dealing with when we're looking at children in disasters here in the United States. We also know that children have unique needs. They're not just little adults. They are completely dependent on adults and caregivers for their needs, for their basic needs, for their communication, for their identification, for their movement, for their nutritional needs, emotional needs, and safety and protection. And we know that they require special attention due to their dependence on adults for survival. And especially in emergencies, we have to be able to provide the care for the children specifically so that in the longer term we're helping them with their longer term development and growth. So who we are as Save the Children, we work in 120 countries in the U.S. and around the world. We invest in childhood every day in times of crisis and for the future. We're dedicated to ensuring that every child has the best chance for success. And so in the U.S., Save the Children is a dual mandate organization. We are both a humanitarian organization and a longer-term development program. And in the U.S., we work in 18 states doing longer-term programming on education, on health, and then also we do U.S. emergencies work. And since in the U.S., we are the leading advocate and responder for children in emergencies. We've established since Katrina the National Commission on Children in Disasters. Working with FEMA, we represent a seat on FEMA's National Advisory Council, and we're both a national and state VOAD member. And we sit on the National Mass Care Council, leading the Children in Disasters Coalition, and we're a Red Cross partner at Save the Children. And so, like I've mentioned, we protect children in emergencies. Since Hurricane Katrina, we've served more than 800,000 children impacted by U.S. emergencies, from anything from the floods in Colorado, the recent tornadoes in Mississippi, Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Ike. We've been there. We've responded to every major disaster since Hurricane Katrina. Like I've mentioned, we've led on the Commission for Children in Disasters. And in addition to our partnerships locally with other VOAD members and FEMA and Red Cross, that we partner nationally and locally. And then we also publish every year an annual disaster report card, which is where a lot of the statistics on my first slide came from. We do polls and we try to see if the states around the nation meet 4 standards for children in care, especially those in schools and child care centers. So currently we are responding to the situation in Texas, aiding unaccompanied children who have crossed the border. That's an ongoing response for us that we started in June of this year. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is our Child Friendly Space program, which is a signature Save the Children program that we use globally around the world in refugee camps in Syria and South Sudan and everywhere in the U.S. that we go into shelters. And it's basically a signature program that's designed to help ensure that children are safe and protected in shelters and other locations after a disaster, where we know that emergency shelters usually put children and their families in cramped quarters, in crowded refugee camps or crowded mega shelters like we saw in Hurricane Sandy and Katrina. And the kids are in unfamiliar environments. They're with strangers. They don't know what's happening. They don't know the extent of the crisis. and there's very little support offered to them in these shelters. And so our child-friendly spaces are a critical component to supporting both the children and families in these temporary locations following a disaster. It's a program that's structured. It's supervised. We have trained Save the Children staff and volunteers who go in and set up these child-friendly spaces in the different shelters. And the program has routine, like supervised activities for to strengthen their resiliency and help them to begin to cope on what happened. And so it gives them that sense of normalcy. It provides them the safety. And then while it helps children interact with peers, build their self-esteem, and begin the recovery process, and then also while we're focused on the children, it allows the parents, the temporary respite care, to have time to register for other emergency assistance and start to reestablish and reestablish their lives, focus on them, take care of them. And so what our child-friendly spaces are all over. We work in the disaster resource centers that FEMA sets up, referral and assistance centers, the American Red Cross shelters, outdoor spaces in communities that, like mobile home communities that have been destroyed and they don't have access to the shelters or they're not able to get there. We'll set up mobile CSS in those areas. And any space can be transformed into a child-friendly space. In Texas, we had a really tiny spot, a little corner of a mega shelter that we transformed into this space. And at the end of the day, the children don't care the size or the location as long as they feel safe and secure and they have the trained staff to work with them. They're quite content to be there. We have over 800 child-friendly space kits pre-positioned all over the nation with the American Red Cross. And so it helps us to rapidly get in and deploy as needed when a disaster strikes. So we don't have to worry because we know Red Cross, when they set up an operation, they'll be able to give us our kits going in. And the kits have all sorts of resources and tools to support the development of child, to support active play, reading, story time, arts and crafts activities. All of that is in these kits. And so what we, in addition to having our Save the Children staff work in these child-friendly spaces, we've also partnered with, we've trained emergency management officials in 28 states across the United States. We've trained FEMA in the different regions on child protection and resiliency. We've trained also 3,000 NCCC AmeriCorps volunteers who come in and help support us in these programs, as well as staff from Parks and Rec, the YMCA, Medical Reserve Corps, and lots of American Red Cross volunteers, as well as child care providers. And we offer this training both in person, and there is also an online training component that's through one of our online platforms on the Get Ready, Get Safe website, which you all will get after this. And so, yeah, we're happy to provide it. That's the end of my presentation.
Okay, thank you so much, Sarita. We really appreciate that. Now we're going to turn to a poll question that relates back to Sarita's presentation, which is really to find out how many of you on the call, whether your state or territory has any kinds of formalized plans to care for children in temporary shelters. So we'd be interested in learning from you how much work needs to happen out there around this particular issue. We'll wait a moment or two to see the results. But it's looking like many of you do not have that type of formalized plan. So we hope that this will be something that will encourage you to undertake and take a look at how you expect to respond when many families will be brought to shelters and what, in fact, will happen to the children. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll, and we can see that 63% of you don't have any type of formalized plan. There's about 15% of you that do have such discussion as part of your ESF6 plan, and then it looks like some of you have some plans that are other, and if you want to go ahead and describe that in the chat box, while we move back to our presentation, you can do that just so that others might learn a little bit about exactly what that plan looks like. If you would also want to type in which of your states do have temporary shelter plans, that would be great for us to share as well in the chat box. So we'll move on from that, and I'm going to move on now from the poll to our presentation from FEMA. And we're fortunate today to have two different presenters and to talk about two different aspects of FEMA assistance as it relates to child care. So first we're going to hear from Molly Vancho, and she'll be talking specifically about public assistance that is available through FEMA, and she'll explain what that is. And then we'll hear from Angela Lohman, who is here from the Individual Assistance Division and is going to be talking to us about a new policy that allows individuals who might not already have child care subsidy to actually access some resources to support their need for child care after an emergency. So I'm going to turn it over to Molly and Angela.
Thank you. As Abby said, I will be starting off talking about public assistance and how it relates to child care. As you all probably know, FEMA has a number of different programs in support of our mission, and we'll, again, be addressing two of them, public assistance and individual assistance. Primarily, I'm going to be talking about how a private nonprofit organization would go about getting the assistance that would be eligible from FEMA's public assistance for those PMP organizations that provide child care services. A child care service is an eligible service, so a PMP that provides that service would potentially be eligible for some reimbursement under FEMA's public assistance program. In order to apply for public assistance, a PMP would have to go through the state, as the state is the grantee, and would have to contact the State Emergency Management Agency to obtain information about attending an applicant briefing. FEMA works with the state to brief applicants at applicants' briefings all over the affected areas after an event. There are meetings run by the state to provide information to potential applicants on the process involved in applying for public assistance and the potential assistance that can be provided. And in order to obtain the assistance, the first step would be to actually submit a request for public assistance, or an RPA. At the same time, we recommend that PMPs that provide child care services apply simultaneously to the SBA and FEMA, because that application to the SBA will ultimately impact the level of assistance that FEMA may or may not be able to provide. To be eligible for public assistance, a PMP has a few specific documentation requirements that have to be met. They must submit a ruling letter from the IRS or some satisfactory evidence from the state that it is, in fact, a nonprofit organization doing business under state law. A PMP must actually own or operate an eligible facility. In this case, we're talking about a child care center or Head Start program, and that facility must be open to the general public. And also, to be eligible for FEMA public assistance, a PMP must be legally responsible for the disaster-related repairs to the facility that is damaged. So I'm going to first talk about the type of the assistance that can be provided for the actual damage that a child care facility may have. So first thing, under a public assistance program, once the PNP submits the application and is approved as a public assistance applicant, if that PNP has a facility that was damaged, the cost to repair the building, replace contents and equipment, remove debris, and perform any emergency work, all of that work and the cost associated with it is eligible for reimbursement. The reimbursement is subject to a cost share. Typically, this cost share is 75% federal and 25% non-federal. The costs associated with the provision of a temporary facility for a damaged child care facility may be eligible for reimbursement, and that would be considered emergency work. Your options for providing temporary facility include lease, purchase, or construction of a temporary facility, and FEMA will fund the most cost-effective of the various options. Temporary facility assistance is normally only provided for 6 months, but where appropriate, a longer time period may be approved. And this is just a matter of requesting a time extension for that assistance, but it is subject to review. Utility, maintenance, and other operation costs are not eligible for reimbursement, just the actual provision of the temporary facility, the costs associated with that, but not the costs associated with operating that facility. So then moving on to emergency child care services that can be, that FEMA can assist with under the FEMA Public Assistance Program. Those child care services that are provided in conjunction with congregate care shelters and standalone child care centers stood up by states or locals, whether they're government-run or through a state-local contract with private provider, those services are eligible for reimbursement subject to our cost share. Reimbursement for the cost of providing child care services terminates when the emergency sheltering operations end. And the reimbursement may be eligible for services provided to both sheltered populations and other disaster survivors. However, for the other disaster survivors, there is an additional coordination piece that has to go on between FEMA's regional administrator and HHS. So some eligible costs associated with these child care services, things that FEMA can reimburse, are the labor costs. So the regular employees of an eligible PNP that actually performs the duties in direct support of child care operations. For those employees, overtime pay related to the duties is eligible for reimbursement. For regular time and overtime costs for contract labor or temporary hires would be eligible, but only the overtime for the regular employees. The facility costs, such as minor modifications to make a child care facility habitable and functional, shelter safety and security, shelter management, and cleaning and restoration after the temporary facility is no longer needed. Those costs would be eligible as well. And lastly, supplies and commodities needed to run the shelter in the temporary facility, the child care services in the temporary facility, such as food, beverages, cots, linens, blankets, and pillows. And now I will hand it over to Angela to talk about individual assistance.
Thank you, Molly. Okay, so as Molly said, I'll be talking about individual assistance in child care. The Sandy Recovery Improvement Act of 2013 gave FEMA the authority to pay for eligible child care expenses as disaster assistance under the Other Needs Assistance provision of the Individuals and Households Program. Basically, in order to determine how we were going to implement this authority, we formed a work group that was comprised of multiple individuals from headquarters in the field. We also coordinated with the Department of Health and Human Services and the IRS to ensure that our assistance wouldn't create a duplication of benefit with any programs offered by HHS, and to also ensure that any assistance provided would not be taxable. After numerous discussions with our work group, we were able to finally develop a policy which went into effect on January 17th, 2014. In order to be considered for child care assistance, the applicant would generally need to be eligible for IHP assistance in general, and they would also need to have a disaster-related need for child care. This means that basically due to the disaster, the applicant had incurred or will incur an increased financial burden. For example, if the applicant's pre-disaster child care facility is closed due to the disaster and their new child care provider is more expensive, then FEMA may be able to provide assistance to offset the new expense. Another eligibility criterion is that the post-disaster child care provider must be licensed and regulated by state and tribal government laws. And also, the applicant must certify that they are not receiving duplicative assistance. And lastly, that their child must be of an eligible age, that is 13 or under, or age 14 up to 18 with a disability as defined by federal law. Oh, and to go back really fast, in order to show FEMA that they have an increased financial burden, the applicant will be able to provide us pre-disaster and post-disaster receipts or estimates. As stated, only one applicant may be awarded assistance on behalf of the child. So if the child is a member of multiple households, only the applicant with whom the child resides for the majority of the calendar year will be eligible for assistance. FEMA may provide up to 8 weeks of assistance to meet the applicant's disaster-related child care need, and we work very closely with the state and tribe in order to establish a maximum amount of assistance an applicant may receive. With FEMA assistance for child care, eligible expenses are considered child care expenses, which include registration fees and health inventory fees for those requiring a new child care service provider. Ineligible expenses, which are expenses that FEMA will not pay for, include fees for extracurricular activities, transportation, educational services, medical care or services, and recreational camps or clubs. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We really appreciate both Molly and Angela providing us with some basic information about FEMA assistance. What we're going to turn to next is a poll to find out a little bit more about your awareness of the various types of assistance that might be available in the child care realm. And so if you could respond to whether you're aware of the following resources that might be brought to bear following an emergency or disaster, that would be great. Because oftentimes I think there are people who only know about FEMA, but in fact are not as well informed about some other types of assistance that might be available. So we're seeing people responding here, and actually I'm pretty pleased to see that there's a lot of folks who seem to have a good understanding of a fair number of these. I'm going to end the poll right now, and we can see that a vast majority of you are familiar with FEMA public assistance. The individual assistance is very new. As Angela mentioned, it just started in January, so the fact that over half of you already know about it, I'm very impressed. There's a fairly large number of you that are familiar with SBA emergency loans, less knowledgeable about disaster unemployment assistance, which again is an interesting one to pursue. And there is very few, relatively, that know about EPA resources around mold, which is a very prominent issue that occurs in a lot of places given the number of emergencies and disasters that have to do with flooding. Good number of you know about public health resources, about half around mental health resources. So, and if there are other resources that you've used, a few of you have noted other, feel free to share that information about what those others are in the chat box. Okay, so why don't we move on? And I've got another poll for you. And so one of the questions really arises as to what are the areas that your state or territory really needs help with. Is it around assisting with facility assessment? Is it assistance with child care and disaster recovery centers? Development of child care options for first responders? Assistance with developing waivers or flexibility for regulated child care, something that we discussed in webinar 3. Increasing understanding of available federal, state, and local resources that are available. Supporting providers to develop continuity of operations plans. And then the last one listed here is whether folks need TA assistance around developing the piece of Emergency Support Function 6 that deals specifically with care for children in mass care situations. So you could all respond to that.
And I'm not sure, I'm having a bit of a technical difficulty. Oh, it looks like it is working. I apologize.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to end the poll here, but it's actually what's pretty interesting to me is that there's a fair number of you that need all of this types of assistance. So I think the good news is that we have tried to develop resources that we can make available to you in all of these different areas. And it's also really clear that the states and territories are in different places in terms of their needs. And some of you can be resources to others around these areas. So we'd also love to hear from you if you feel like you've got a really wonderful example of any of these areas so that we can share that information with other states and territories. Okay, well, we are moving on at this point, and we're incredibly fortunate to have two presenters, both of whom are in Louisiana, and who can share with us really direct experience that they've had around two very significant hurricanes, Katrina and Isaac. So we'll be hearing from Diana Constant of the R&R that is named Agenda for Children, that's in Louisiana, and Rita Perilou, who is a child care provider who experienced these things firsthand. So I'll turn it over to both of you.
Thank you. In 2005, Katrina, a Category 3 hurricane with wind speeds 100 to 140 miles an hour, stretching 400 miles, created more than $100 billion in damage.
I apologize. I don't mean to interrupt. I just wanted to say that we're having a little bit of trouble hearing you, so if you could speak a little bit louder, that would be really helpful.
Okay, we'll try something else. Is this better?
Good. Mm-hmm.
Okay, sorry about that. In 2005, Katrina, a Category 3 hurricane with wind speeds 100 to 140 miles per hour, stretched 400 miles, creating more than $100 billion in damage. Almost 2,000 people lost their lives. Slow response left families homeless, without shelter, food, or water. Child care was slow to recover. As a resource and referral agency, we were not prepared for this disaster. After several days, the families pictured here were sent all over the United States. Many busloads of these families were brought to the shelters in Agenda's regions. They arrived with the clothes on their back and little else. We depleted our offices of materials and toys to bring to the shelters. The National Guard welcomed us with open arms. They had no idea how to or what to do with the kids. The families were traumatized. We did not have a plan, but we did act. We set up a messy play area in the center of the university gym where the families were living and began to play with bubbles, Play-Doh, crayons, paper, and paint. The children drifted over and began to play while keeping within sight of their families. The university sororities and fraternities became involved and made donations of supplies. The children continued to play with the materials provided while parents filled out forms and applied for services. The shelter remained open for almost 2 weeks.
Hi. Hello, my name is Rita Perilou. I'm a little hoarse, you guys, but I would like to tell you that we at Little Leaders Learning Center, we have a 4-star preschool located in Reserve for the last 16 years. And I would like to just revisit a little bit about Hurricane Isaac in 2012. After more than 4,000 residents were chased out of their homes by rapid rising floodwaters, Hurricane Isaac weary residents in St. John the Baptist Parish turned to cleanup and assessment, while the authorities announced Friday that the residents could get federal help with the process. All of our staff at Little Leaders Learning Center were impacted by Isaac. Returning to work was difficult, if not impossible, for some for close to 2 weeks. We can truly relate with and concur with the comments made by Ms. Beverly Weldon about Superstorm Sandy. We could revisit that in our mind as well. The families that we provided care for were also impacted greatly. Low enrollment was a result of the damages sustained. Families slowly returned to work and began the recovery process, and many of the children that we served were traumatized. We then turned to Agenda for Children to support us and help us in the area of mental health support. In St. John Parish, Isaac severely damaged over 12 family child care homes and destroyed one center entirely. The majority, experienced flooding.
In Louisiana, the child care resource and referral contracts include disaster-related deliverables. Our staff are second responders and may be required to locate, visit child care and family child care homes in disaster-impacted areas, and also to set up and staff child respite areas and shelters. Following Isaac and Katrina, as second responders, we were required to provide the following information about the damage to child care centers and family child care homes that we visited, possible dates of reopening, providing statements from the providers regarding their businesses. Agenda charged us with gathering information about the needs, providing information, and supporting providers in meeting any needs that they might have. As an agency, we moved a little bit too fast.
There we go.
As an agency, Agenda for Children created an emergency plan that includes a phone tree for staff, demographic information on all staff, a current list of child care centers and family child care homes contacts. Each staff member has a written plan as well as a thumb drive containing all necessary information. Agenda's technical assistants all have a large store of toys and materials to bring to shelters that they keep in their homes. Each of Agenda's 3 regional offices also has a large store of materials in each of the offices.
And child care providers in Louisiana, they require that we have a written emergency plan. Additionally, each center is required, and the family centers as well, to have a go-to pack as well as a kit for sheltering in place.
Sorry, we're having technical difficulties here. Response after Isaac. We baptized our new early childhood director, Carrie Kearns, newly from Ohio, Iowa, with Isaac. She was instrumental in developing and implementing our plan for providing support for the children who have been through disasters. Agenda for Children was grateful to an anonymous donor, Save the Children, Discount Schools, Kaplan, and Winn-Dixie for contributing to the recovery of early childhood programs in St. John Parish after Hurricane Isaac flooded many homes and businesses. Agenda staff began to work in this parish as soon as the waters receded. All child care centers and family child care homes were visited, and information was gathered concerning the level of damage they sustained in each program's immediate needs. At the same time, Save the Children hosted meetings in Laplace, or actually St. John Parish, to hear firsthand the needs of children and families in the area. As a first step, all the programs were provided with Johnson & Johnson care kits. Agenda staff and Little Leaders Child Care Center staff unloaded trucks and began dispersing kits to the programs. There were over 700 kits dispersed to very grateful people. With additional donations, 3 kits of equipment were valued over $600 were provided to each of the providers.
As a child care provider, we were glad that we were included in helping to gather the donations, and we also invited Agenda for Children to use our facility. We have a great big sanctuary that we were using as a distribution site, and the people in the community were received it so very well, and our staff also were able to help with the distributions, and it was so well received.
Our emergency and response plan includes guides for helping the child care providers prepare for the disaster, to protect the children and their businesses, also to how to inform and help parents before, during, and after a disaster, how to set up temporary child care, and suggestions for restoring child care and coordinating donations. The children we have worked with through these disasters first needed their families close by and emotionally available. Many of the parents, while close by, were not available because of the trauma they were dealing with. The simple play and creative, messy play and art activities allowed the children to do their work, to play, and to express themselves through that play. Sharing their work with their families allowed for some normality for at least short periods.
Again, as a child care provider and a recipient of Agenda for Children staff response to Hurricane Isaac, I can reflect on how comforting it was to get a call from Miss Diane to ask how we made out and how we were doing. Well, that was the beginning of the healing process for me as a business owner. Her concern inspired me to help other centers that were affected as well. Little Leaders linked arms with Agenda and reached out to other centers, helping them to provide whatever was necessary, whether it was a safe meeting place to gather and check in with one another, or a working office with computer use, copier, fax, telephone, etc., or whether it was a listening ear or a place to get the supplies that we talked about, supplies of food, water, toiletries, cleaning supplies, children's diapers, pull-ups, wipes, formula, etc. Overall, we were able to provide assistance in helping the other schools in our area get back into compliance so they could reopen as soon as possible. In conclusion, Agenda for Children was there for us from the beginning to help strengthen us back to our health. They provided follow-up training afterwards to prepare us for future emergencies. They even contacted us with Save the Children and other organizations and agencies that continue to help us during the recovery process. And Little Leaders can definitely relate to the processes that were spoken by the representatives from FEMA, because we were fortunate enough to receive assistance from them as well.
Child care advocates should prepare to assume a primary mission. We need to advocate for the kids before, during, and after a disaster. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, and we appreciate the participation of Diana and also Rita, and I'm going to turn it over to Susan.
Yeah, thanks, Abby, and to all of you thus far this afternoon. Your stories, your words of wisdom, your experiences have been very helpful, I think, to all of us in the audience to hear and to learn about. I have a few questions that have been coming in this afternoon and some that came in prior to today, but first and foremost, would like to ask Diana and Rita, when you think about your biggest challenges from your experience with Hurricane Katrina and overall for you, how do you think you've overcome those challenges? Diana and or Rita?
The challenges were great. As Beverly spoke of was it Beverly? I'm sorry. Mm-hmm. Yes, on Superstorm Sandy. Everything she said, the lack of telephones, the lack of communication, and the roads and getting to places safely was extremely difficult. That was probably the worst part of it. And just being there to hold hands and say we were so sorry and we were going to work to get things better for these people who had lost their businesses and everything else. Thank you. So being cut off from others and not having immediate access is really key from what you had to say. So I thank you for that. Rita, anything from you that you'd like to share?
I was definitely fortunate enough to have people reach out to us, and we were in great need, and I'm telling you, it inspired me, because as soon as we got up and running, we reached out to everybody else, and it was definitely encouraging to have Agenda for Children there. I mean, I can't express enough. I mean, even my family saw me after I got that first phone call cry, and then I got myself together, and then from that point on, we were able to get some normalcy together and, you know, pull up our bootstraps. But what I experienced was, nobody could do this alone, and so I'm just grateful for what you guys are even doing right now to help prepare, you know, the future business owners so they wouldn't have to have the devastation that some of us experienced.
Thank you for your comments. I think you're both striking a chord with us, as did Beverly when she spoke to us. And Beverly, that is the question that we have for you, is when you think about preparation, now that you've experienced such experiences, Superstorm Sandy, what comes to mind as lessons learned for all of us in thinking about preparation towards recovery and rebuilding? Well, I think first of all that we can never be fully prepared for whatever is going to happen, but we tend to think of emergency preparedness and response, as a response to storms. But there are other incidents like pandemic flu, other emergency situations that we also need to consider as we develop our plans. So it's almost like you need to have a plan for every incident that could possibly occur. So I think it's really, really important for individuals and states and agencies to work on not only preparing but the COOP planning that needs to occur. Thank you, Beverly. Great words of wisdom on that front to think about. Another question that we had is to ask our FEMA colleagues to describe a situation where public assistance was provided and how the process works, something that stood out for you in a lesson learned, challenges to share, outcomes that were made.
Well, this is Molly Ivancho, and I really am not, our child care fact sheet that we developed recently was a result of the Superstorm Sandy and the challenges that everyone encountered with child care services after that event. Me personally have, I don't have any on the ground, boots on the ground, there we go, experience with child care services and FEMA providing assistance, public assistance. So I don't have any lessons learned or actual experiences to share. I don't know if Angela has anything with respect to individual assistance.
No, not really. We were able to implement child care assistance, as again, the policy finally went into effect in early 2014, in a few disasters, and they've been quite successful from what we can gather.
Yeah, as far as I can share, it's just third-hand stories, war stories that I've heard in the field, but I'm not the one to speak to actual examples.
Well, thank you. I do think that folks are looking at, as we saw in one of our last polls, about access and resources. So as time goes on, we may want to be working together more closely and talking about those experiences, hopefully in preparation and not in the end of it all. So
absolutely.
Yes. So another question has come forth, and Sarita, it's for you and Save the Children. Could you talk about child-friendly spaces and any issues that people should be thinking about in advance as they think about friendly spaces?
Yeah, I mean, there's all sorts of guidelines. We have a manual for how to implement child-friendly spaces, but I think the most important piece of it is the safety and well-being of the children, and so ensuring that whoever you have running the child-friendly spaces are trained to work with children, are background checked, and know how to work with children who have gone through traumatic experiences, such as a hurricane or a tornado. And so just really, because our program is very specific, and it's very specific in its intention to support the resiliency for children and make them feel safe, secure, protected, it's really important that the staffing matches that.
Thank you, Sarita. That's really very helpful comments to understand and hear, and just reiterate the importance of people working together and their roles and credentials. One other question around that did come in this afternoon is, are the child-friendly spaces for unaccompanied minors as well? So could you give some comment around who is in the spaces as they're available?
Yeah, and so we set up our child-friendly spaces anywhere that there's an assistance shelter. So for the unaccompanied crisis, we worked with FEMA Corps directly to train them and provide the material support, and they were providing the child-friendly spaces to the unaccompanied minors who were in Border Patrol custody. And then we were providing child-friendly spaces in the Catholic Charities assistance shelters in Texas that were for accompanied children who had a caregiver. And we were doing the direct programming for those, and then the ones in the Border Patrol facilities were FEMA Corps volunteers.
Thank you very much. I'm sure that our questioner appreciated your comments there. And to any of the presenters this afternoon, any key lesson learned comment that you didn't have the opportunity to make, we do have a few minutes for you. We also have the chat box still open if any of you have any questions in the Q&A section, but wanted to open it up to the presenters and hear if there's anything else they would like to add to the conversation that they neglected or felt rushed to respond to or share. Well, Abby, I think we'll turn it back to you.
Okay, we're good, and we'll go forward. There are a number of different resources that are available to all of you in terms of helping you with the development of your comprehensive plans. One of those items is a very comprehensive guide that the Child Care State System Specialist Network has developed around emergency preparedness, and it includes a whole host of materials that can be helpful. And one of those sections is specifically on recovery. And so therefore I think that resource will be very helpful to you. In addition, there are more resources that you can find on the OCC website. There is a section specifically on disasters and emergencies. And there is also a link here to the CCTN resources. And as we've mentioned, this PowerPoint will be available to you after the webinar. And so you'll be able to use that link. And that link will bring you to a whole host of materials that are that have been developed for this series of webinars. I also want to mention that at the close of these webinars, the last to occur in November, we will also be developing a final document that will incorporate a range of resources for each of the webinars that has occurred, where we've identified as we've gone along additional resources that might be of use to states and territories as they develop these comprehensive plans. Here I have listed out for you, for those of you who are interested, some of the resources that are very specific to this particular area around recovery. So we've got the major website for the federal government for people who need to make claims, and that's disasterassistance.gov. FEMA.gov, we've got information about the Small Business Administration, their disaster loans. There's information from the Department of Labor around disaster unemployment assistance. And I think people will be interested to learn more about that, in that unemployment disaster assistance is not limited to those people who are actually employees, but they may in fact also be independent contractors. And then finally, the last link that's given there was something that was developed post-Katrina when, as Sarita noted, the last child was reunified with their family 7 months later. This was developed so that we would not experience that kind of delay in the future. And once there is an emergency or disaster, that is something where people are concerned that there will be children who may need to be reunified with their families. This link gets active, and that's something that can be used nationwide. Okay, so we are going to have a little checkout poll here, and then we'll provide you with some information about next steps and conclusion. But I want to hear from you through the poll as to which of the following topics would be most useful to you in your emergency preparedness work going forward. And it did appear from previous polls that there still is a fair amount of work to be done in many of the jurisdictions on many of these issues. And once again, I want to, reiterate to all of you that, number one, don't become paralyzed by the fact that there's lots to do, but the incredible need to undertake this work, given how important it is. I'm going to wait 1 minute to let everyone have a chance to enter their responses in the poll. And we're starting to see that we've got quite a few of you who still need to work on how you're going to respond immediately after a disaster. We've got even more of you that need to really focus in on how you're going to go about developing child care in temporary shelter situations. And I know that in many instances the CCDF lead agency has not necessarily been involved in that effort because it has primarily come through the ESF-6, the Emergency Support Function 6, which is part of your larger state multi-hazard plan, but it just underscores the incredible need for the CCDF lead agencies to connect with their state emergency management agency. You need to be able to help them understand child care, and they need to be able to work with you to help you in emergency situations. About half of you are interested in really following up around what federal resources are available to support you. A large proportion of you are wanting to be focused on the role that child care resource and referral agencies can play. And a few of you may have some other interests, which I hope that you will share in the chat box. So we can move on from there, Lori. Okay. Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about next steps and then conclude. As I indicated at the beginning of this webinar, we are having 6 webinars, and our next webinar will be the last webinar in this series, and it is primarily focused around responding to trauma. So developing those types of policies that would allow flexibility in the temporary care, collaborating to provide child respite. But the most important thing here is that we're going to be looking at resilience of children and support to families. And I noticed that there is an error here, and this really should be about responding to trauma and to resilience, and that will be the focus. We also will be sending you an evaluation in SurveyMonkey that will be sent immediately following this webinar. And I just want to conclude here that the development of a meaningful and specific and comprehensive emergency plan is a very complex and time-consuming process, and we understand that often it falls to the bottom of the list when people have many other things on their plate. However, as we've tried to underscore throughout this entire webinar series, this is a critically important effort that really needs to be made a priority. The specifics that we've talked about today include really paying attention to the provision of child care in disaster claim centers, as well as with temporary shelters, and the fact of the need for setting up temporary child care facilities, helping providers repair and rebuild when they have lost their facilities completely or whether they've been damaged. And I think we are really clear about the need to provide immediate and ongoing assistance to families and providers to navigate the entire recovery process. So to the extent that you can learn as much about how that recovery process will play out after a disaster, and then really be in a position to guide people when that unfolds, will be of enormous assistance. I think one of the things that we haven't talked about as much is how important it is to provide information through a variety of forms of media in multiple languages. We've talked a little bit about, how important communication is and how likely it is that people will have problems, whether it's with their cell phones or with the power. They may not have access to computers. So it's super important for people to be thinking about every single possible mechanism for communication with people after a disaster. In some places, social media has played a huge role. In other places, it is flyers and handwritten material. So we really need the whole continuum of resources available, and they need to be made available in multiple languages so that people who do not speak English are aware of how to proceed. I love this quote from a person who had done a report around the emergency responders after a very significant earthquake in New Zealand. And she wrote, "Recovery is about taking opportunities to grow great communities following hardship. Great communities emerge on the backs of great people." And I think this is so true that we have seen repeatedly that people come through after emergencies, but how much better to be prepared for that. We are encouraging you to be those great people. So we hope that you'll take the examples and ideas from today's discussion and use them in your broader efforts towards developing your state and territory emergency preparedness and response plan. And I want to invite you to come to our next and final webinar that will be held around trauma and resilience, and it'll be held on November 10th at 3:30 Eastern Time. So thank you all, thank you presenters, thank you audience, and we really appreciate your participation, and we hope that you will be encouraged to continue your work on emergency preparedness. Thank you so much.